Why write? Why write? A very large advance. Bob Dylan says he doesn't write songs, he writes them down. So I find, or I found anyway, at the age of 66, after my brother Frank wrote Angela's Ashes, and somebody wrote to me or called me up, Charlie DeFanti, and he said, "You must have a book in you too." And I was thinking about how do you get that out? You have a literary bowel movement, and away you go. It was a matter of writing it down because, as he said, I've heard your stories before, and so therefore just write them down. So I found it was eminently satisfactory to sit there and write down and tell the story to myself. And without being egotistical about it, I just thoroughly enjoyed myself. I used to do radio in New York. For years, I was on talk radio. And I always said, I can't wait to hear what I have to say next. As far as professions are concerned, I still haven't made up my mind yet. I left school when I was 13. There was a thing there about getting a steady job with a pension. And one of the ones they talked about in the school I went to was a job where there were a lot of horses on Limerick streets then. And one job was going around with this barrel on wheels, big wheels on the side, and a shovel and a broom, and you shoveled up the horse shit and dumped it into this barrel. So you got that job. It was a coveted job. And they said, get that. You can retire at 65. So that's only 50 years of shoveling horse shit. That was not my idea of a joyful life or of retiring from anything. I'm now 80 and I have no intentions of retiring. A, I can't afford it, and B, I don't want to. I still do what I like doing, which is mostly nothing as a rule. I read, and I do a bit of writing. I go off and I talk at various places. So what am I? I have no idea. I'm still this bewildered 20-year-old that came back to America in 1952, and here I am, 80, wondering, what am I going to do when I grow up? And when I was smuggling gold to India, there were none of those metal detectors. So I was able to do it with impunity. Not immunity, but impunity. I was in a mad frame of mind. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I was drinking then. I had wrecked a marriage. I was in a state of despondency that seemed to know no depth, and I kept sinking lower, and I didn't care what happened to me. And I used to get in fights and brawls, and it was shameful. I'm ashamed of it now. People have asked Frank about remembering details. If there's very little else in your life you remember. I am sober now 27 years. And as the years go on, my brain, it gets reconstructed. And more comes back, and you start remembering, and you go, oh my God. But it's made a very, I think anyway, an interesting sort of a story. There is a pejorative in what the English say about the Irish. Pejoratively, they say, or Americans say, gift of gab. Now, if you look up gab in the dictionary, you will see that it's words of no consequence, of no significance. And that's one aspect. And then the other is, if they want to put us down, it is that they say, oh, you kissed the Blarneys down. Whereas if you're a Brit, they say you're eloquent, you see. And not us, not the Irish. Where they say we're like children who get colored stones and just throw them up in the air because we really don't know the value of color, of art, of jewelry or anything. We're childlike creatures who really don't know. So that's what we do with the language. We just play with it because we don't understand what we're saying. It's a fascinating thing that it is essentially a second language, although for the Irish, although it's been spoken in Ireland for quite a number of centuries. An American critic in Time magazine, I believe it was, critiquing Brendan Behan's Hostage, talked about this thing of the language. He said, if I can remember now, he said, the Irish derive the greatest benefit from the English language. They court it like a beautiful woman. They make it bray with donkey laughter. They fling it at the sky like paint pots full of rainbow colours. Then they make it chant a dirge of man's fate, of man's follies, like a soft rain falling over the barren earth. They have paid the oppressor the supreme compliment of taking his language and turning it to sorcery. I think of myself as Frank's brother, not a character. He was one of the most non-judgmental people I ever met in my whole life. He was extraordinary in that way, most tolerant, and he loved eccentrics. I mean, for years, he was my brother because I was the public McCourt and Frank was doing his teaching quietly, anonymously. And I used to say to him, if you don't write that book, I will, and you won't be able to. I used to threaten him. And he finally did it. And I was so delighted. It was quite extraordinary. He only asked me one thing. That was about the mother sleeping with the guy. He didn't know what to do with that. And I said, if you don't put it in, there'll be no spine to your book. And of course, I expected him to write admiringly of me, because I deserve to be admired, you see. My father shared a common, I suppose, a curiosity and a literary curiosity that so many people who would be considered ill-read or ill-educated would yet have a love of poetry and a grasp of the language of words that you couldn't quite understand. How do they get that? It would seem that there was a dam for years and there was no literary output from the McCourts. I mean, this generation is the first to ever write. And Frank started it. I met the Minister for Education, the Irish Minister for Education, and he did ask me about where did I go to university? And I said I didn't go to university. And he asked me where I went to the secondary school, and I said I didn't do that. And that's when he said to me, well, how is it you got to write books, one of them on the New York Times bestseller list among swimming and the others? How did you get to do that? And that's when I said to him, I read a lot of books and rearranged the words and wrote them down. So he was very amused at that. So a few weeks later, I got a call from the Irish ambassador to say that the Irish Department of Education, at the behest of the minister, were about to do something that had never been done in the history of Irish education. They were awarding me an honorary primary certificate, an honorary grade school certificate, the only one ever awarded in the history of Irish education since it's got its independence. So there I am. Being a writer like my brother and Peter Quinn and Hamill and all, they create stuff, right? And I think being an author is that I just simply write down all the things that have happened to me or things I know. I don't look upon myself as a creator of anything. I just am simply saying, here is my story. It was the loveliest water I'd ever tasted, and the more I drank of it, the lovelier it became. Then we lay down under a big shady tree, which was the home of dozens of birds, and my father made up stories of bravery and dying for Ireland, and he sang songs and recited poetry and manufactured tales of the doings of the shapes in the clouds. The bees hummed, the birds sang, and the insects cricketed all around as he talked, crooned, and made great use of the language to fill a child's mind with joy and wonder. The marvellous sun began its descent in the sky, and all around us the natives and nature began the rustling and settling for the evening's rest. And my dad told me that all creatures had one thing in common. They all knew how to pray, and that's what they were doing now, thanking God for another blessed and wonderful day. And we should go now and leave them to their devotions. When my father left us and went to England, I went to find the well again. Over the same stile I went, over the same ditch where the stinging nettles threatened, past a big sheltering tree to where the well had been. It wasn't there. No rushes, no well. I tramped all over that field, and the field to the south of it, and to the north of it, and every other field, but never again did I find that well, and never again did I find the Father who brought me there.
Am I an Irish writer? Well, that's not something I'm that interested in. And I think Irish writing now is also in transition, because political strife was a very important and dramatic feature of Irish life, and religious strife was, and the oppression of the oppressions of poverty and religion and so forth, and politics were all part of the Irish experience for a very long time. That is simply not the case anymore. My Irishness is complicated. My father's Irish. I was born in Ireland, but my mother is Turkish, and of a Christian minority that speaks French. So I grew up speaking French as much as I did English, although eventually English took over. And furthermore, my father was a builder of petrochemical installations, which meant that he would travel to all sorts of places. And so for the first 6 years of my life, I lived in all kinds of countries, depending on wherever my father was working. And so I did have a sense all the time of myself as an Irishman, but it was obviously a conceptual relationship with Ireland more than an actual one. Blood Dark Track is a non-fictional account of my investigation into my grandfathers, both of whom were imprisoned during the Second World War, one grandfather being Turkish, the other being Irish. And what begins as a basically personal inquiry becomes inevitably something of a political one. Attached to both my grandfathers was history, as I discovered. And attached to my Irish grandfather in particular was the history of republicanism in West Cork. It was the fate of Republican men, essentially, in the Second World War, or the emergency, as it was called in Ireland, to be interned for the large part of that war. And the reason for that was that in the 1930s, in the late 1930s, there was a violent IRA campaign in England. And actually, it turns out that my great-uncle, my grandmother's brother, was very, very heavily involved in all of that, so that my family was involved in that. And I think the Irish authorities were worried that the neutrality of Ireland would be compromised if, during the war, the IRA continued its military campaign. And so as a result, they interned every suspected IRA man. My Irish grandfather was a man called Jim O'Neill, who was from Cork, and who was interned by the Irish authorities during the Second World War on suspicion of being an IRA man, which he was. And simultaneously, my Turkish grandfather, who belonged to a small Turkish Christian minority in a town called Mersin, went to Palestine on a business trip and was during the war, and was arrested by the British authorities there on suspicion of being an Axis spy, which he almost certainly wasn't. When, as I was growing up, I didn't know these men and their lives, and in particular this episode during the Second World War, was surrounded by a silence. And so silence for a writer is obviously a vacuum into which you naturally, or unnaturally sometimes, enter. Well, in the course of looking into my Irish grandfather's life, I began to hang out a lot with my uncle Brendan O'Neill, who himself was an IRA man. And we went to the family farm in West Cork, and when we were there, I was in the car outside the farmhouse, and my uncle came out of the farmhouse with a towel in his hands, and there was obviously something in the towel, and he dropped the towel. He got into the car and dropped the towel on my lap, and it felt heavy. And I opened it up, and I said, and there was a gun there. My Uncle Brendan said to me, "That's a Colt 45. That's the gun that shot Admiral Somerville." And I hadn't even heard of Admiral Somerville until this point. And then I looked into it, and I learned that he'd been assassinated in 1936 by persons unknown in West Cork. The historical and political significance of the Somerville killing was that it marked the return of violent republicanism to the Irish political scene in 1936. But what did become clear was that my family had been keeping a secret of some kind about this killing. And the question was, what was the content of that secret? And that's what I came to discover. And I'm not going to tell you what that secret was. This complicity perhaps comes naturally in large claustrophobic families, where not everybody can or wants to know everybody else's business, and where mutual unintrusive loyalty is an essential familial glue. "Used to stick together for better or worse," my grandfather would say to his sons. The reservoir of O'Neill Republican confidences was Brendan. He was the son whom my grandfather trusted, and to whom he vouchsafed knowledge of certain matters, so that Brendan might bear witness to them, and, it could be inferred, keep them in memory until they might safely emerge at the lit surface of history. One of the great joys of writing is that you don't know what you're setting out to do, and you don't really know where you're going to end up, and you're exploring, and so I suppose the question of what you set out to do is quickly overtaken by what you are in fact doing, where you're in fact going. And it's possible that I might have foreseen the eventual shape of the book, but it took me 7 or 8 years to write it, so it can't be the case that I had a very clear idea of what I was doing, and I didn't really. I was very lucky in the case of Netherland. It was a book which was bought for not much money, which means that it wasn't, the subject of an enormous expectation, and but it landed on the desks of the right critics who liked it, and so I really did have just in the space of a weekend, my career as a writer changed, as it was reviewed in the New York Times and the New Yorker and other places, and just became a kind of it just became that tiny phenomenon, which is to say, a little critical storm blew up around the book, and so I'm very lucky. And then, of course, when the paperback came out, I heard that President Obama had been mentioning this book, which is obviously good. It was quickly my impression, in this last regard, that making $1 million in New York was essentially a question of walking down the street, of strolling, hands in pockets, in the cheerful expectation that sooner or later a bolt of pecuniary fire would jump out of the atmosphere and knock you flat. Well, I mean, the events of Netherland are not the events of my life, but it's undoubtedly true that I lived here in New York and was kind of impressed with the city, just as Hans van den Broek, this Dutch narrator, was, and I had a sense of wonder about it, and at the same time I also had a certain knowledge of the city, which was given to me by the fact that I played cricket here, and you know, after I started playing cricket here up in Staten Island, after a couple of seasons, I realised that there was a story there. And I realised also that the kind of detail of the world of cricketers, which is a world of immigrants from West Indies, India, Bangladesh, places like that, Sri Lanka, was, you know, capable of being interesting to people, and had not really been written about. I mean, believe me, the great thing about writing a novel of cricket set in New York is that you're not going to be scooped. I have no idea what the significance of cricket is in the United States, or indeed in my book. But when Hans starts playing cricket, he runs into a guy called Chuck Ramkissoon, who's from Trinidad and is a very American immigrant. He's very, very American, and his dream is to build a cricket stadium in New York City. Not only that, but he also dreams, or says he dreams, one never really knows with Chuck, about restoring cricket to its proper place in the American culture. And by this, Chuck means that back in the 19th century, and possibly even in the 18th century, cricket was played in the United States and was the biggest modern sport, and certainly was older and more prominent than baseball was. And so he thinks that cricket is in the American DNA, and it's his job to, as it were, revive this fragment of the American identity. And he makes mention of cricket as an honourable game, as the game which gave rise to the term "it's not cricket." And he says that there's no expression, he points out, to the effect of "it's not baseball" or "it's not football." It's not cricket. And he believes that cricket players are privileged to be playing this game, which has a kind of code of conduct which has a value greater than the sport itself. The American answer to what is cricket is, according to the local legend, effectively America. The Constitution, the possibility of religious freedom, the possibility of economic self-realization, the possibility of escaping from the injustices of one's origins. All of this is touted in the American story as being offered by the United States. So I suppose one of the questions which, you know, arises in this book, as it does in practically every book about the United States, is whether or not there is any basis of, you know, truth in this narrative, the narrative of the American dream, if you will. And of course, not much of America is cricket, and of course not much of the world is cricket, not even cricket. In fact, the only thing in the world that may be cricket is in fact golf.
Oh, the summertime is coming, and the trees are sweetly blooming, and the wild mountain thyme grows around the blooming heather. Will you go, lassie, go? And we'll all go together to pluck wild mountain thyme all around the blooming heather. Will you go, lassie, go? I will build my love a bower round yon crystal fountain, and on it I will pile all the flowers of the mountain. Will you go, lassie, go? And we'll all go together to pluck wild mountain thyme all around the blooming heather. Will you go, lassie, go? And if my love should leave, I would never find another where the wild mountain thyme grows around the blooming heather. Will you go, lassie, go? And we'll all go together to pluck wild mountain thyme all around the blooming heather. Will you go, lassie, go? And live every day as if it's going to be your last, because one day you'll be right.